Supreme Court justices have an unbelievable amount of power. And by the nature and the structure of the Supreme Court, there's no supervision over that power. They are entrusted with it literally for as long as they live. And part of that trust is we expect them to enter into those enormously consequential decisions that shape our everyday lives with a sense of fairness.
And not only is it unacceptable, but to have any one of our co-equal branches be completely unaccountable to the others is paving the path to authoritarianism, tyranny, the abuse of power in the United States.
As the American people continue to learn disturbing new details about the extensive corruption of the United States Supreme Court, Democratic stalwarts like Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg or Democratic Representatives Jamie Raskin and AOC have stepped up to publicly call the court out and to demand necessary and long overdue reform. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to look at in this video. As you know, the Supreme Court is a frequent topic of this channel because I believe that the Supreme Court is by far the most dangerous branch and the one that's the least accountable. And that combination is unacceptable. And it's not just me. Constitutional scholars like Jamie Raskin and, again, Democratic stalwarts like Buttigieg and AOC, they agree as well. And they've stepped up in the past 24 hours to call the court out for various new transgressions that we've learned about, be it Clarence Thomas's, $4 million in disclosed and undisclosed gifts, or the various situation with Justice Alito's flags, the fact that, in the aftermath of the 2020 election and the January 6th insurrection, his home was seen flying a flag, seen during the insurrection that was held aloft by insurrectionists. These are two prominent right-wing judges who serve for life, and the extent of their corruption is really disturbing. So I want to first play this clip between CNN and Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg on the topic of Alito and recent revelations we learned about Alito and his wife.
I want to ask you very quickly about another subject, too. There was a secret recording made at a meeting where many Supreme Court justices and their spouses were. And Martha Ann Alito, the wife of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, was discussing how she feels about apparently a pride flag that was flown not far from her house. Listen.
I want a Sacred Heart of Jesus flag because I have to look across the lagoon at the pride flag for the next month.
Exactly.
And he's like, oh, please don't put up a flag. I said, I won't do it because I'm deferring to you. But when you are free of this nonsense, I'm putting it up and I'm going to send them a message every day.
How does that make you feel knowing that the wife of a Supreme Court justice wants to send a message to people with a pride flag?
Look, I'm often reminded that the most important thing in my life, which is my marriage and my family and the two beautiful children that my husband Chasten and I are raising, that marriage only exists by the grace of a single vote on the United States Supreme Court that expanded our rights and freedoms back in 2015 and made it possible for somebody like me to get married. And, Supreme Court justices have an unbelievable amount of power. And by the nature and the structure of the Supreme Court, there's no supervision over that power. They are entrusted with it literally for as long as they live. And part of that trust is we expect them to enter into those enormously consequential decisions that shape our everyday lives with a sense of fairness. I also hope that most Americans can understand the difference between a flag that symbolizes, love and acceptance and signals to people who have sometimes feared for their safety that they're going to be okay, and insurrectionist symbology. And I'll just leave it at that.
Great point by Secretary Buttigieg. As a reminder, he is an openly gay man. He's married with 2 kids, and he's referring to the 2015 landmark Obergefell decision, which effectively legalized gay marriage in this country. Now, after the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas suggested to his 6-3 conservative supermajority that perhaps the Obergefell decision should be revisited, right? They were already overturning precedent like Roe, which had been established for 50 years. Why not revisit things like, the Supreme Court cases which protect gay marriage or the right to birth control, things like that? And so For that reason, President Biden and congressional Democrats were able to pass the Respect for Marriage Act, which effectively, for the most part, enshrined the Obergefell protections in federal statute. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Supreme Court can't strike that down either, right? Remember, congressional law is subject to judicial review. But this is also why it's important to elect Democrats, right? Why votes matter. Because if not for that, then it would be purely at the discretion of the Supreme Court. They could just snap their fingers the next time a challenge to gay marriage made its way up to the courts and overturn it. At least Democrats have acted meaningfully to try to enshrine and protect those protections into federal law. But again, what Buttigieg is talking about in terms of the trust is so important. It's part of the reason why I talk about this as much as I do. You have to understand, consider the arrangement that we have. United States Supreme Court justices aren't elected. They aren't reelected. They aren't subject to term limits. And there's very little, if any, oversight from the other two branches, as a matter of fact. And so in exchange for these lofty considerations, we expect them to behave unlike politicians. Politicians can behave partisanly. They can behave pettily, even if it's ill-advised, even if they shouldn't do it. They have the right to do it. Supreme Court justices, as far as I'm concerned, as far as the founders were concerned, don't have that right. They need to be as close to robotic as possible, and they are constantly reneging on their part of the deal. So why should we hold up our side? Why shouldn't we institute democratic reforms to this rogue branch? Well, AOC makes a pretty compelling case for it, and then we'll get into what Congressman Raskin has to say.
And the position which Justice Alito has actually taken on the record, he actually said in a Wall Street Journal interview that Congress has no ability to regulate us whatsoever. What should Congress be doing? What are you brainstorming, basically? Like, what's the conversation about what those checks can be?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, Justice Alito's position is laughable in this idea that he can be and that the court should be accountable to nobody, and that the only person that they should be accountable to are themselves. This kind of Scout's promise sort of setup for how we should be having ethics standards for the highest and most consequential court in the land. It is completely unacceptable. And not only is it unacceptable, but to have any one of our co-equal branches be completely unaccountable to the others is paving the path to authoritarianism, tyranny, the abuse of power in the United States. And it is structurally completely unsustainable. And so it is not a question of if Congress has jurisdiction and power over the Supreme Court. It is what power are we going to exercise in order to rein in a fundamentally unaccountable and rogue court. And one of the beautiful things about today's roundtable is that we were able to also call in one of our Senate colleagues, Senator Whitehouse, who has been pursuing extensive investigations into the dark money network that has been exerting influence over the court. And we raised and discussed a varying degree of measures, from term limits to an actual binding ethics standard. And also Congressman Raskin and myself will be introducing a forthcoming legislation to even have the Supreme Court be subject to the same $50 gift rule that he and I are subject to as everyone else is as members of Congress.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that $50 rule here in a minute. But the crux of what she was getting at is what I was getting at earlier, which is, so there's this notion, and actually I disagree with AOC here, that the idea that the three branches are co-equal, and so does Congressman Raskin, even though he doesn't contradict her in this conversation. It's a canard that we're told by civics teachers across the country, that the legislative, executive, and judicial branches are all co-equal. They are separate, right? And they're each important and powerful. But there's nowhere in the Constitution or the founding documents where the founders referred to or treated the three branches as co-equal. As a matter of fact, you can find writings from James Madison and Alexander Hamilton that the judiciary was meant to be the weakest of the three branches, the least dangerous of the three branches. These are direct quotes, because they didn't have the power of the purse, which is what Congress has, nor do they have the power of the sword, which is what the executive has. They were supposed to have merely judgment, and they were completely dependent on the other two branches. It was supposed to be the least active and the least powerful branch. Important, but not equal, and certainly not dominant, which is clearly how the Supreme Court regards itself, right? They believe that they can impose checks and balances on the president and on Congress, and therefore the American people writ large, since those are the American people's closest political proxies at the federal level, but that the American people, Congress and the president, can't check the court, that it's a completely one-sided dynamic. It's incredibly gross, it's incredibly irresponsible, and it flies in the face of what the founding fathers intended, what the Constitution provides. Because at the end of the day, Congress can check the court. It's just a question of will they. What the Supreme Court, and particularly what Justices Alito and Thomas are banking on, is that there's too much fraction and schism within Congress to ever impose any sort of meaningful check against them, right? You got to think about it. Republicans are happy with this 6-3 conservative supermajority because even if, Clarence Thomas is raking in $4 million in disclosed and undisclosed gifts, and even if Justice Alito, Samuel Alito, is flying flags, showing solidarity with the January 6th insurrectionists, well, Thomas's money is coming from right-wing billionaires, and the insurrectionists are right-wing Trump-supporting Republicans. So it's to their benefit. And even if it weren't, they are reliably producing verdicts and outcomes in cases which are to the Republicans' benefits. Not always, but reliably. So in their mind, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And they don't want Democrats in any way to try to check this court, which is delivering them the results that they want. Super gross stuff. I want to play this clip too from Jamie Raskin, which expounds on that $50 gift rule, because this is a really good concrete example that should blow people's minds, that this is the standard set by Congress and there are standards set for the president, but the Supreme Court doesn't have to match any of it.
I mean, Congress has a ban on outside employment, and as AOC was saying, we have a $50 gift ban, so none of us goes anywhere near doing that.
Oh, you don't do $500,000 vacations?
Well, I mean, that's
free?
the comical thing. I mean, members of Congress don't even understand that. Under what circumstances would a Supreme Court justice be accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars in foreign travel or paid tuition for family members or a recreational vehicle, motor stagecoach? It's just outlandish for us to contemplate. I mean, that's like a jailable offense for people over here. And it's just like the normal business as usual at the Supreme Court that they're collecting millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of dollars from their so-called friends. And so we need to clean that up. And that's why, we said we're going to start with something simple that the whole country will be able to understand immediately and intuitively. We want a $50 gift ban for U.S. Supreme Court justices. They make $300,000 a year, pay for your own lunch, and pay for your own vacation.
What's controversial about that? Who could offer a good faith resistance to that idea? And that would apply, by the way, not just to the conservative justices, but to the liberal justices as well. And to be clear, even though I am, somebody who's much more aligned with the liberals and the progressives on the court, I think that the entire institution, I don't trust any of them with the kind of power and discretion that they're given now. It is despicable. It is unacceptable that all this stuff, that financial disclosures and recusals are entirely discretionary. No, there should be an oversight body, particularly with respect to judicial ethics, because there's an oversight body with respect to judicial ethics for every other court in the country, for state Supreme Courts, for federal courts, for circuit courts, whatever. It doesn't matter. The United States Supreme Court's the one exception. And again, Congressman Raskin made this case, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse made this case during the roundtable that they're referencing, which is that even the president of the United States is subject to some sort of fact-finding mission and ethics review, which is why President Biden sat down and spoke to, Special Counsel Robert Hur, right? So if it's good for the president, and if it's good for senators, if it's good for congresspeople, if it's good for governors, et cetera and so forth, why should these 9 unelected philosopher kings be any sort of exception? They shouldn't. There is no good faith argument that the only reason that you would want this system as it currently stands to remain is because you are pleased with the outcomes, the judicial outcomes that this court is giving you. That's it. Checks and balances should be reciprocal. The court is absolutely subject to checks and balances. This is supposed to be the least of the branches, the weakest of the branches. The president is supposed to be more powerful than the Supreme Court. And I think it's really, really important that Democrats in the House and the Senate during an election year, to the best of their ability, make it a point to talk about this, to shine a light on this, especially as we learn new sort of details about the Supreme Court. Make it a campaign issue, because public trust in the United States Supreme Court is at an all-time low. People are not happy with this court. They are not happy with the current dynamic. And it needs to be leveraged as a political issue because it could help us win elections. It could help us win votes. And then once we have them, then President Biden, with all due respect to him, he's such an institutionalist, then he should also be willing to cram reforms down the throats of the United States Supreme Court as is necessary. I hope this is something that Democrats make a much bigger issue, and I hope it's something that we campaign on because I think it is a wildly popular idea. Let me know what you think in the comments.